candle over my right shoulder. Gone through that entire candle. Know what that means? That means this is it, my friends. Sixth and final discussion, final talk. Yep, we are done. And this one's going to be something else. So, we're going to have to really focus on this one. It's not easy, nor was it meant to be. But hopefully, everything we've been doing all of these days, all of these weeks will kind of coalesce into some sort of, oh, I don't know, this is what it's all about, maybe. I hate this is what it's all about. Let's just say, it'll make the journey worthwhile. So, our final discussion is entitled I'm Not There. Percy, Shelley, Bob Dylan, and why it's really all about the immaterial. I mentioned the immaterial early on and said that I'd get to it, and now I'm going to get to it. Okay, listen, I tried to avoid Bob Dylan for as long as I could, but it just isn't possible. Don't worry, I'm not going to, Mr. Tambourine Man, Like a Rolling Stone, the Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, etc., etc. I'm actually going to take my time, getting to Dylan, so I guess I can, justify my inclusion of the bard of contemporary music lyrics, as if his inclusion actually needs justification. We've seen a lot so far, and clearly for my project, it's impossible to hit on everything. Far from it, as a matter of fact. But taken from what we've seen from the questions of, fame and celebrity with Kurt Cobain, to the experimentalism of Pearl Jam, the feminism of Alanis, the political poetry of rap, the romanticism of the Grateful Dead, the absurd aspect of Wet Leg, along with all of my various other illusions. Well, I think it's time that we go back to some traditional poetry for one last time to help, maybe bring all of this together. So you've noticed, clearly ambiguity and doubt have been at the forefront of my readings, which may strike some of you as odd. I don't know, should an English professor be more interested in focusing on the concrete? Actually, the opposite's true. Critical thinking and interpretation are never about discovering some sort of hidden truth. Absolutes have little to do with the world of art. And to paraphrase Dr. Johnson once again, if poetry is the mirror of life, then poetry should reflect life accurately. How many absolute truths do you find in your daily life? Where does certainty fit into the actual world? You see what I'm saying? So, these questions take me back to the Bronx, circa 2004-ish. Man, I really do miss grad school. Getting a PhD is a daunting task, but it's also a hell of a lot of fun. Subtract the student loans that I'm still paying off and the meager pay for teaching introductory composition courses. I was basically going to school for free and getting paid to just read a shit ton. Of course, there was that dissertation thing that was a fairly brutal endeavor, along with my dissertation defense that still gives me nightmares. At the time, I think my anxiety was at its peak, and I actually bombed the defense of my dissertation. I don't know how I managed to pass, but I did. But I look back on those 7 years of reading and writing, quite fondly. At the same time, going through that experience, I made lifelong friends, both fellow grad students and some of my professors. But the few nights a week, there was a group of us, and we would always meet at the Jolly Tinker, on Webster Avenue, across from the New York City Botanical Gardens. And you can't put a price tag on those get-togethers. The Tinker was a hole-in-the-wall Irish pub, an undergrad hangout just a few blocks from Fordham's campus, filled with, beer pong tables in the back room, along with a pool table and a halfway decent jukebox in the front of the house, in which the students would wear out Billy Joel's Piano Man and Don McLean's American Pie, on a nightly basis, accompanied by student group sing-alongs. However, in the early evenings, the bar was filled with locals from the Bronx and Yonkers, as well as graduate students of various disciplines. And it was there that on one night, a group of my friends and I gathered after class to sit in a booth while consuming Miller Lite and shots of Jameson. I remember quite clearly the conversation I had with my friend John that evening. I was pontificating about William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. Shocking, right? But anyway, and the connection that I felt to that particular lyric, mainly because I saw the poem as a pure instance of, I don't know, individual expression that I felt a strong connection to, as if the poem were speaking to me and me only, as if there was some sort of connection between me and the poem that could not be ruptured, as if I and I alone understood something about that poem that no one else on the face of the earth could quite grasp. The wonders of youth. Yeah. Still, my buddy John, asked me about the political ramifications of the poem. And I remember responding with, dude, it's not a political poem at all. Well, his response floored me and has stuck with me ever since. All art is political. Those were his words. Now, I've been grappling with those words ever since, especially in terms of a poem such as Tintern Abbey, a lyric that on a surface level, seems to be about some dude revisiting a natural setting he used to frequent as a youth, and the changes that come with time, along with the ramifications of memory in terms of personal growth. Yeah, there's a lot to it, but what the fuck is political about that? Well, it turns out a lot, actually. Thanks to Jerome McGann's The Romantic Ideology from 1983, I want to say. I think right around then, early 80s. Yeah. The poem has come to be read or reread as actually an intimation on the effects of the French Revolution. Wordsworth's poetic speaker, constructing a youthful, childlike wonder from his past that mirrors the early days in revelry and excitement in Paris in 1789, followed by the realities of maturity and all of the baggage that comes with knowledge. We've heard about this. Clearly, symbolizing the skepticism and doubt that confronted the Jacobins by 1792 with the bloodshed brought on by the Reign of Terror, experiences that Wordsworth himself witnessed firsthand on two walking tours of France in 1789 and 1793. I think I've definitely brought this up before. Oh well. Though the revolution itself is not mentioned once in the poem, which was composed in 1798. But even without being mentioned, the sensation via symbolism is there. And that's what poetry can do. Yeah, mine kind of blown at this moment. At least mine was first time I read that. But that's not the end of it. With more social and capitalist critiques becoming in vogue the previous past few decades, the poem can also be read as a kind of constructed privileging of those with power, i.e., those who have the opportunities to attend institutions such as Cambridge University, as Wordsworth did, and a false consciousness that very much marginalizes the lower classes. Jeez. And I thought it was a poem about some dude, looking at some hedgerows while thinking about himself. I think I scared off my dog Percy. He's not into Wordsworth. Oh well. Listen, my initial reading is not wrong. It just goes to display the provocative and layered elements that exist within the world of art. In this case, the written word. In all honesty, my early way to read poetry, I think, was kind of elitist, probably egotistical, as though I had some kind of individual relationship with certain works that excluded others, and more importantly, excluded other readings and readers. Yeah, we're going back to those early chapters on individual growth. Yeah, okay, so let me explain this a little bit further. From my late 20s to my mid 30s, Wordsworth was my man. Again, shocker. From him, I came to understand that a romantic, open perception of the world could help us, as individuals, become better, well-rounded human beings by examining personal experience and the past. To confront who we once were and to analyze our faults and negativity as a means to grow as individuals, kind of echoing the Grateful Dead reading from a few talks back. Yeah, it was a type of personal therapy, no doubt. which takes me to the past 10 years or so and another type of growth that I learned through Wordsworth's fellow romantic poet, kind of fellow, he was a second generation romantic poet, Percy Shelley. Dog's named Percy for a reason. Percy Shelley looked upon the world openly and also discovered a world of doubt and confusion. Nevertheless, while Shelley similarly looked inward to understand the world around him, his conclusion was quite different from Wordsworth's. Instead of experience and examination of experience lending itself to an individualistic understanding of the world, Shelley found that the ambiguity within life offered us as individuals something quite different, and that is empathy for our fellow human beings. Yeah, that's personal growth for you. As a youth, I thought just about me. As I grew and matured, I came to understand the importance of thinking about people besides myself, people different from me, people who experience the world differently. My buddy John had a really good point. Of course, I touched upon this sense of personal growth previously, but let's get into some Percy Shelley and then see what this has to do with Bob Dylan and maybe reading in general. I've got to get to some kind of conclusion eventually, so let's get going. And of course, I'm going to begin with, guess what, an anecdote. Now, I'm not sure if it was 2018 in Greenville, South Carolina, or maybe it was 2019 in Manchester, England, in which I delivered a conference paper on Percy Shelley's poem, Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. Now, this is a completely irrelevant kind of digression, but it really amuses me, so I guess I'm asking for a little bit of patience. Now that I think about it, it was 2019. 2018 was a disastrous paper that I delivered on the little-known Romantic era poet John Clare at a conference hosted by Clemson University. Yeah, that was in Greenville. Ugh. The nightmares from that conference on romantic culture still exist to the day. The conference was centered at the Hyatt in Greenville. Greenville's a pretty cool little town. But that Hyatt, it was a hotel that reminded me of the Purgatory Hotel from the International Assassin episode of The Leftovers. So I will never forget it. The eeriness existed from the beginning, and the whole trip was doomed. It was really a doomed endeavor from the get-go. As good as my paper actually was, and I think it was pretty good. Not sure if I've already referenced, by the way, that incredible HBO series, The Leftovers. That's 3 seasons, ran from 2014 to 2017. But in that one particular episode entitled International Assassin, the main character, Kevin Garvey, played by Justin Theroux, consciously kills himself, believing he can come back to life. And ends up in this dreamlike world purgatory, symbolized by a typical everyday hotel where he must accomplish a certain task to get back to life. All right, no more spoilers, okay? But yeah, that hotel in Greenville, it was totally the hotel from that episode. Freaked me out. However, there were just too many things going against me on that trip. From the hotel itself freaking me out, to most notably, though, being that the Boston Red Sox were in the World Series. And for those of you who recall 2018, memory is a tricky thing post-pandemic. So I understand if a little bit of confusion still exists. But for those of you who do recall Game 3 of that series, then you recall that 18-inning marathon that kept Red Sox and LA Dodger fans up until past 3 a.m. Eastern Time. Jeez. The Dodgers, 3-2 victory, had a game time of approximately 7 hours and 20 minutes. And unfortunately, I'm kind of a Red Sox fan. Not nearly am I as much a baseball fan as I am a football fan, but I root for the Sox when they're good. All right. When I was an undergrad at Boston University, the Red Sox sucked. I used to be able to walk over to Fenway Park after class and buy bleacher seats for $10 so I could, go watch Mark McGuire and Jose Canseco or Ken Griffey Jr. when they were in town. And getting back to that conference in Greenville, to make matters worse, the evening of Game 3, I befriended an important editor of a distinguished journal in my field who also happened to be a Red Sox fan. So we spent most of the night at the hotel bar consuming way too many libations while cheering on the Red Sox. So I kind of had to stay up no matter what, just to kind of put in the face time with this gentleman who may one day publish some of my work. In all honesty, I never submitted anything to his journal out of embarrassment. I was hammered that night. Um, However, once the bar closed at 2 a.m., I ventured up to my hotel room, by myself to finish watching the game for another, hour or so. And I brought a bottle of wine with me. It was a bad decision, especially since my panel and my paper was the next day. Uh, yeah, and I would somehow have to present my work to my peers. Yet the game kept going and going and going. Listen, I by no means encourage this type of behavior, especially for you junior faculty out there or you graduate students trying to make your way up the academic ladder. Yet I am what I am, no matter when I'm supposed to deliver a paper. So I stayed up till after 3 in the morning watching that game. The next day, I was blurry eyed, dizzy, anxious, and all the Klonopin in the world was not going to get me in the proper headspace. And the Red Sox losing did not help. Though, in retrospect, they ended up winning the entire series, which was awesome. But actually, the delivery of the paper went over without a hitch. However, I couldn't answer a question during the Q&A if I wanted to. After reading my paper, I remember praying that all of the questions would be aimed at the other two professors on my panel, hoping that their works would draw more intrigue. And, for a while, I felt like I was in the clear as the first 10 minutes of the question and answer session was focused on the other two professors. I didn't even care that this meant my paper didn't draw as much intrigue. I just wanted the whole thing to be over with, considering the pounding going on in my skull at the time. And then it happened. A question to me, and a question about Nietzsche. Fuck, why did I have to include Friedrich Nietzsche in my paper? One of the most convoluted of all thinkers. Yet I had to say something. So my mouth opened and outpoured as much jargon and gibberish as possible. None of it comprehensible. And my response was met with utter silence, as I clearly failed to convey any sense of logic. Simply enough, I sounded like a fucking moron, and I didn't even have to look up, as I could literally feel the horror on every face in the audience. It was an epic fail, even though I ran into the questioner later at the hotel bar and was able to answer his question in a lucid and sophisticated manner. I remember him exclaiming, "Why didn't you just say that during the panel?" I responded, the only way possible. I couldn't. And that was that. A little less than a year later, at the conference in Manchester, England, this is when I delivered on Shelley. Listen, I'm getting there, people. I recall being approached by a professor from NYU who introduced herself and said that she was in the audience during my paper on John Clare the previous year in Greenville. The chills ran up my spine. We exchanged pleasantries, but I could not get away from her fast enough. The terror and shame, clearly still on my face. She stayed for my paper on Shelley that day, which went over fairly well, as I lucidly answered all questions, even the dense theory question thrown my way by some professor from Oxford. Still, the memories from that nightmarish experience in Greenville from the previous year tormented me every time I met eyes with that professor from NYU. These are the types of experiences that exacerbate so-called imposter syndrome. So I guess let's get to Percy Shelley. So his poem, Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, from a titular perspective, sounds as it might be, some serious Dead Poets Society shit. Yet it is far from the flowery, stereotypical poem about emotions or carpe frickin' diem. It's probably the most complex of any of the lyrics we have looked at thus far. So brace yourself, my friends. Now, as opposed to many of the first generation Romantic poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge, most of the second generation British Romantic poets, such as Shelley, were a lot more radical in terms of their distrust of traditional institutions. Remember, Shelley was good friends with Lord Byron. And though their critiques may not sound as radical from a contemporary perspective, in the early 19th century, these poets were deemed the satanic school of poetry. Ooh. Not that they were actual worshippers of Satan by any means. However, this moniker signified a symbolic connection to John Milton's Satan from Paradise Lost. A figure deemed to be, the ultimate revolutionary and nonconformist by many Romantic era thinkers. And yes, Shelley was expelled from University College, Oxford, for co authoring a pamphlet entitled The Necessities of Atheism. A treatise that basically argues that the existence of God goes out the door with the Enlightenment's focus on empiricism, that which can be observed or demonstrated. Which is actually correct, though certainly a no-no in the early 19th century. Indeed, it might be empiricism, the world of our senses, the world of observation, the world of fact, proof, and universals that Shelley takes aim at in his hymn to intellectual beauty. All right, people, shit's about to get real. So as I just said, brace yourself. If you want, look the poem up, take 10, 15 minutes, then come back to me. And here we are. Now, for Shelley, something else exists in this world around us, something that cannot be proven, materialized, or put into some kind of math equation. And he's certainly not talking about God. He begins the hymn by recognizing this unseen power that floats among us. Throughout the poem, Shelley references this unseen power in various iterations. As a phantom, a ghost, a voice, a power, all of which are shrouded in what he calls doubt, chance, and mutability. Signifying the unpower's fleeting meaning. Yes, this spirit of intellectual beauty is the titular reference, which may seem odd at first, considering Shelley keeps the subject matter hidden in a cloud of uncertainty, an uncertainty that is ever changing. In the fifth stanza, the poet speaker acknowledges his early attempts at trying to understand the mysteries of the world through the medium of religion. As he writes, while yet a boy, I sought for ghosts, and sped through many a listening chamber, cave and ruin, and starlit wood, with fearful steps, pursuing hopes of high talk with the departed dead. I called on poisonous names with which our youth is fed. I was not heard, I saw them not. When musing deeply on the lot of life, at that sweet time when winds are wooing all vital things that wake to bring news of buds and blossoming, sudden thy shadow fell on me. I shrieked and clasped my hands in ecstasy. Now, clearly, church doesn't work for Shelley's poets. This stanza signifies his rejection of traditional orthodoxy, which attempts to answer the unanswerable in the guise of certainty, i.e., God. I'm going to come back to this religion stuff later. However, the rub is that Shelley does not want this mystery or this mysterious entity to be clarified. The questions of the world are beautiful simply enough because they cannot be answered. In an echo of John Keats's negative capability, once again, there's a reason Shelley and Keats were pretty much pen pals. This is an affirmation of life. Shit happens, and there's no way to justify it or comprehend it through any kind of universal manner. It's the ultimate statement of humility. There's only so much we as human beings can know, and this assessment is an affront to the power of reason and science, along with all of those out there that claim they know what it's all about, or even worse, those who keep their heads buried in the sand because the reality of uncertainty is just too much. Remember, why would one choose to stand on the moon? All right. Indeed, as we've already covered, ignorance is bliss for oh so many. Hence, the poet decides to dedicate his powers to thee and thine. The antecedent to these pronouns being the world of mystery and uncertainty. Alas, poetry becomes the recourse for addressing the wonders of the mysteries of this world we inhabit. Poetry is not meant to provide answers. Poetry is not here to tell us what it's all about. No, poetry and lyricism are nothing more than symbolic gestures to help signify that which actually cannot be signified or encapsulated absolutely. Like I said, deep shit. Yet, in a moment prescient of Edna St. Vincent Millay's Spring, which we covered a few talks back, Shelley writes in the final stanza, "The day becomes more solemn and serene when noon is past. There is a harmony in autumn and a luster in its sky, which through the summer is not heard or seen, as if it could not be, as if it had not been. Thus let thy power, which like the truth of nature on my passive youth descended, to my onward life supply its calm to one who worships thee, and every form containing thee, whom spirit fair thy spells did bind to fear himself and love all humankind." Like Millay, we again have an deconstruction of the typical signification of the seasons, as summer, the season of ease, light, exuberance, lacks something that the season of decay, autumn, clearly encompasses in the poet's eye. Now, not coincidentally, this dynamic is another moment of pure reversal in terms of expectations. Irony, Alanis. Shelley locates the significance where we typically not expect to find it. And this is what the poet dedicates himself to. The beauty and the wonder of not knowing, of our inability to properly utilize the world of empiricism and reason as a mean to explain the mysteries of life. Language itself even falls short, for language is a malleable tool. Go ahead, look at the Oxford English Dictionary. Seriously, take a moment, look up any word, and you will not find one singular definition. However, you will find an ever expanding web of definitions spanning time and place, while also including the importance of context. I'm going to come back to this. Alas, even the specific subject matter of Shelley's poem is kept in the realm of ambiguity, as intellectual beauty lacks a concrete signification, and the poet relies on vague language, that voice, phantom, power, spirit, to represent this, quote, beauty. Hence, Shelley's praise is not for the knowable, but the wonders of the mysteries of the world and that which we cannot ever know. So, why devote ourselves to the unknowable? Now, do not misread this, peeps. The poet does not want us to dedicate our time to discovering the mystery or figuring out some all-encompassing absolute truth. I would actually argue that Shelley's focus on the unknowable is exactly what takes us to Shelley's own politics. Shelley has some fairly straightforward political poetry, most notably his Mask of Anarchy, a poem that addresses the tragedy behind the Peterloo massacres of 1819, in which thousands of laborers gathered at St. Peter's Square in Manchester, England, to peacefully protest for a stronger voice within Parliament. That's why I was in Manchester in 2019 to celebrate the 200-year anniversary of the Peterloo massacres. But anyway, subsequently, a local militia ran down the protesters, leading to many deaths and scores of injuries. Shelley's poem confronts the hypocrisy of government officials, members of parliament, as well as the monarchy, all in an attempt to offer a voice for the common people. Ye are many, they are few. This rallying cry from Shelley's poem has gone on to be used for 2 centuries at various peaceful protests and political rallies, symbolically coming to represent the voice of the masses, those overlooked and underrepresented by the establishment. Yes, there's a reason Shelley was on Karl Marx's bookshelf. Blacklisted again. Ooh. Now, what does this very specific political stance have to do with the focus on ambiguity found in Shelley's Hymn to Intellectual Beauty? Well, the connection between these two poems is actually quite logical. By concentrating on the importance of not knowing, especially in the world of art, a medium that ignites curiosity, Shelley opens up the world itself to interpretation. In other words, he denies a static existence, or maybe more importantly, a static meaning, in favor of change, malleability, and curiosity. In so doing, the poet offers agency to us, the readers and the masses. It is up to us to think, to disagree, to recognize other opinions, to favor difference as opposed to uniformity and certainty. Truly, this is the foundation for critical thinking, knowing that there is not just one way to perceive the world around us, or in this case, the words around us. Alas, a stance such as this, takes Shelley to empathy for those in differing situations, those outside of the center, those without the privilege and advantages of being part of the establishment, an establishment that clearly does not desire change. Now I'm referencing those who think that there is an exact moment in time when the world was great and did not need to evolve. Not going there. The politics of ambiguity are clear. It's not just about me, it's about Shelley's final line, to love all humankind. Now, this sense of empathy only occurs through the acknowledgement of uncertainty. Yeah, without doubt, Shelley's politics really do not exist. Something I will clarify soon enough. Now, to where I've been going this entire time, Robert Zimmerman. That's Dylan's birth name for those of you living on the fucking moon. Didn't mean to go back to another moon metaphor, interesting metaphor. His unreleased lyric, I'm Not There, from the Basement tapes recorded at Big Pink with the band in 1967, is by no means a canonical Dylan moment. Far from it. However, with the release of the song in conjunction with the brilliant Todd Haynes film of the same name in 2007, I'm Not There has garnered attention in recent years in the most Dylan-esque of ways. All right, I haven't seen the Timothée Chalamet movie yet. I'm going to. I'm sure he does a really good job. But I know the narrative of that film. I'm sure it's good. But I'm not meaning to be biased, and I don't mean to jump to conclusions. It can't be anything close to I'm Not There. I don't know. Maybe I'll write something else or put something else out there if I'm completely wrong about this when I finally do watch it. But anyway, the reason behind the attention is mainly owing to the fact that the song I'm Not There doesn't have official lyrics. There are no lyrics for I'm Not There posted on the official Bob Dylan website. And a cursory search on the internet will find a multitude of interpretations of his words from the one recording that does exist, though there is little agreement on the words themselves. I mean, it's frickin' Bob Dylan. If ever there was someone whom you did not want to have to decipher phonetically, it's Dylan. The song actually has never even been played live, and that's saying something for someone who has constantly been touring since well before I was alive. Of course, there are moments of clarity, which we'll get into in a moment, but taken as a whole, the narrative is incomplete. It's a fragment, never meant to be whole. Indeed, this might be the Kubla Khan of Dylan's overall whole poetical career. Famous due to the fact that the vision will not ever be complete. I have not mentioned Kubla Khan before, but that is one of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poems that depicts a vision that he had while falling asleep after taking laudanum for an ailment. The poem's significant because Coleridge was interrupted while composing the work and could never recall the exact vision, from his dream. Hence, it is the actualization of an incomplete vision, never to be complete. Just like Dylan's I'm Not There, it will never be whole. There will never be an answer. Listening to the song, there is really not a beginning or any kind of intro. So seriously, press pause right now and then press play on whatever device you're listening to and jump right in because that's exactly what Dylan does. So if you've listened to the song, yeah, he jumps right in without any warning or introduction. Yeah, listening to the opening verses, it's almost as if we're intruding on someone's internal stream of consciousness mid thought. Moving forward with the few moments of lucidity offer is a narrative concerning a disconnect within a relationship. Our poet speaker who seemingly desires the presence of a significant other, but something seems to obfuscate any potential connection. A connection that, when it does occur within the lyric, is ephemeral at best. From the significant other's perspective, we have someone who finds solace in the presence of our poet speaker, but the inevitable absence results in tension. Indeed, this is one of the more distinct lines within the lyric. When I'm there, she's all right, but she's not when I'm gone. Absence is the clear culprit within this lyric, and if anything survives from the conglomeration of ambiguity, it's just that: absence. The few words that are intact are as follows. I don't belong there. No, I don't belong to anyone. But I'm not there. I'm gone. That's pretty much it. You can pinpoint certain nouns, verbs, and adjectives throughout, but you're not going to be able to piecemeal together anything concrete in terms of a whole structured narrative. And that very well may be the point, especially considering this is Dylan. However, what must be acknowledged is the clear desire for clarity and connection within the lyric. All right. Now, I'm going to do my best, and there is nothing 100% certain about this translation of mine. But here are the words that I do decipher in the third to last stanza verse, which is maybe the most lucid in terms of comprehensibility. So I tread lightly here, my friends. All right. Yeah, she's gone like the rain below the shining yesterday, but now she's home beside me, and I'd like her to stay. She's a lone, forsaken beauty, and I don't trust anyone. And I wish I was beside her, but I'm not there. I'm gone. Now, to quote Quentin Tarantino, let's not start sucking. All right, you know the line. Or at least you should. Okay, that's from Pulp Fiction. If you don't know what I'm talking about, anyway, I'm not taking it any further. Point being, this is pretty close to most interpretations you'll find online, so I'm not claiming to have discovered the Holy Grail. This stanza just happens to be the most lucid of the entire lyric in terms of its phonetic comprehensibility. Yet I find this verse to be significant due to what the words do signify. As previously mentioned, some kind of yearning for connection. However, the last three lines thwart any attempt at appeasement, for not only is there a wish for some type of panacea or cure-all, but there is also the inevitable lack of trust, along with the realization that, as we've seen before, our first-person speaker is absent and cannot take part in this resolution. Indeed, the crux of the lyric relies on distance, lack of cohesion, and an utter inability to construct any sort of presence or absolute resolution. Dylan's choice to never play the song live or offer any sort of explanation to the lack of words only solidifies this assessment. Take a moment, all right? Let's think about when you're driving around in your car. We've all done this. You're singing along to a song that you really don't know the words to. All of you know what I'm talking about. You're bobbing your head to the music. You feel something. You're experiencing some kind of sensation. And almost instinctually, you try and put words to the music, even though you don't know the actual words themselves. But there's that instinct to try and capture something. There's that drive to capture via language, whatever it is that you're feeling. And then, I don't know, sometime in the future, it could be in a week or a year, you actually learn the lyrics and something changes. You come to see the song differently, whether for good or bad. But once the actual words come into being, something changes. You may understand the song differently, but it clearly is not the same thing as when you were driving around the car the first time making up lyrics. Hence, the lyrics themselves offer something different from just the music. But it's clear that there is also something else within the song itself that is outside of the words, something within the song that cannot be captured even by the lyrics. You know what I'm talking about. There's a sensation, something immaterial about the song that defies language no matter the words themselves. Remember, so many talks ago when I was talking about Dionysus and Apollo, and I mentioned Dionysus representing music and Apollo representing words? Here we are. Alas, this takes me back to Percy Shelley's hymn, which I find to be quite useful in looking at Dylan's lyric or lack thereof. Remember, the significance of Shelley's poem exists in its reliance on or privileging of that which we do not know, the mystery, the ghost, the voice, geez, even absence, none of which can ever be properly put into actual univocal words for Shelley. Shit, I can't believe I just used that word. Univocal. Sorry for the jargon. Look it up if you have to. Anyway, I guess I'm going to go to James Joyce to help clarify the connection between Shelley and Dylan. Yeah, on a side note, I think I may be the first person in the history of the world to use James Joyce to help unpack a convoluted linguistic construction. But here it is. Joyce writes the following. Poetry, even when apparently most fantastic, is always a revolt against artifice, a revolt, in a sense, against actuality. Another attempt at defining or describing poetry, but man, is this useful. In so many words, Joyce suggests that poetry is not meant to represent anything concrete or anything as it actually is. Poetry is inevitably an attempt at displaying things not as they are, but as they are not. Poetry thrives on absence. You're welcome, Jacques Derrida. It is an art form that rejects truthful representation. Remember, Plato calls poetry a lie. Now, recalling what I had to say about Shelley's hymn taking aim at the empirical world, I think we're getting somewhere. The world around us, from its birth to frickin' tomorrow, is always going to include confusion, lack of understanding, mysteries, gaps. Hence, if we wish to acknowledge or express this indeterminate reality, what better way than through the world of lyricism, which shuns absolutes, universal answers, instead preferring an open discourse, multiple interpretations, an everlasting reality symbolizing the malleability of perception and understanding. Now that's poetry. That's our world. That's Shelley, and that is Bob Dylan. In thinking about Shelley's inability to name or clarify the signification behind intellectual beauty, we can take all this a step further and accord to the titular aspect of the Dylan lyric. Yes, I'm not there says a lot, even without actual words. As previously outlined, the lyric relies on absence, as does the title. Hence, the lack of clarity in terms of the words becomes irrelevant. For as we learn through Shelley, what is important in poetry is the stuff that we cannot name, the immaterial, the sensation, the mystery, the paradox. Now, in thinking about Joyce's definition of poetry, why is it that Dylan, for over 6 decades, rarely plays the same song the same way? He's constantly mixing up the music itself along with the lyrics. Poetry or lyricism is a revolt against actuality. There's something that words themselves simply enough cannot capture. Hence the tendency of artists to change the words. Taken as a whole, all of this suggests that language and lyricism is by no means a perfect science, nor is it meant to be. Lyricism is an attempt to capture something, intellectual beauty, all right? Yet it's an attempt at best. Never a perfect rendering of this immaterial something that's somewhere within or surrounding all of us. But poetry is not that something. It's a representation of that something. Oh, yes, for all of you Platonists out there, this is very Platonic. The difference is that for Plato, this is what makes poetry dangerous. For Shelley, and I'd argue for Dylan as well, this is what makes poetry and lyricism so significant. Think about it this way: why are there reissues and remixes that artists release so many years later? Even the artists recognize the failures of their very own art. Most of them are quite cognizant that their art is not perfect, nor will it ever be. Lyricism is meant to be fluid, and that is the beauty behind artistic production. We as audience members can do exactly what Shelley's poet does when he decides to dedicate himself to thee and thine. We can continually disagree concerning interpretation, find something new in texts we're familiar with, have a dialogue with those we disagree with, and possibly learn something we've never seen on our own. Uh-oh. All right. Sounds like I might be getting into all that political stuff I mentioned earlier in the chapter. However, I want to wait a little while longer, and we're going to come back to that. We're going to go back to Dylan again, okay? Yeah, let's think about this sense of uncertainty in the context of the panoramic of Dylan's overall career. How are we to define Dylan in terms of genre? Okay, so the film version of I'm Not There, and I'm pretty sure the new one, A Complete Unknown, again, the title itself fairly, again, utilizing Dylan's lyric, an echo of I'm Not There, relying on confusion. But yeah, the film version of I'm Not There, actually relies on this question. Indeed, it's the very foundation of the entire film in terms of both Dylan's genre and identity. Hence, if you've seen the film, and you've got to see this film, the multiple character portrayals, none of which actually bear the name of Bob Dylan, instead relying on iterations of his persona throughout the years, from poet to folksy protest hero, to Woody Guthrie wannabe, to on-screen celebrity, to electric artist, to tortured husband and father, and finally to outcast on the run. He's all of these and none of these. Defying classification and refusing to be defined by a public who feeds off of constructing and projecting certainty. Phew. Yeah, in the film, the malleability of his identity, it thwarts certainty, resulting actually in confusion and even anger and vitriol, manifested by a public that thrives on that which is knowable. If you look at all the scenes with the various figures questioning the Dylan characters, searching for some type of answer. I mean, how many of you out there get pissed off when your favorite artist changes their sound or their image? It's really so freaking annoying seeing the public get all butthurt. I just had to use that phrase again. When artists defy expectations. I still have friends and fellow fans of Pearl Jam who over the years just want to hear them remake, their first album 10 over and over again and are immediately turned off when Pearl Jam no longer sounds like Pearl Jam. What the fuck does that even mean? Thinking of genre, my favorite scene in that Dylan film is the metaphorical moment when the Cate Blanchett iteration plays at that pseudo Newport Folk Festival, which in 1965 was the actual moment when Dylan did go electric. I know that's what the new movie centers on. But in the movie I'm Not There, Blanchett and her bandmates, they mowed down the audience with machine guns. It's really such a fitting scene, as Dylan really did kill off all expectations in terms of sound and identity. In reality, people freaked the fuck out in 1965, which again kind of baffles my mind. Getting angry at artists for being artists. Change and malleability come with the territory, as we've already covered, all right? On a side note, this type of experimentation does not always work out, as my man crush Chris Cornell, RIP, learned during his brief foray into dance pop through his collaboration with Timbaland in 2009, though I admire the fortitude. But, my dear listeners, it's not all about you and what you want. If Shelley has taught us anything, this immaterial thing that exists through art and life is constantly changing. Hence, change is to be expected. Change is inevitable. The words, or lack thereof, in the Dylan lyric, actually make perfect sense. He's not there because he was never meant to be there. Go ahead and try and pinpoint anything concrete concerning his art or his identity. You won't find an absolute Bob Dylan, nor will you find a category that signifies his music in any absolute manner. Art completely resists the all encompassing aspect of language. Words fail, hence, they are not always necessary, nor are they always useful. Going back to Pearl Jam, sometimes the sensation is enough, whatever it may mean. Do I actually have to reference their song Yellow Ledbetter, which does not have any official lyrics either? Eddie improvises the words almost every time he plays the song live. That's the reality. And if anyone ever dedicated themselves to this reality, as Shelley did, it was Bob Dylan. Well, as the Romantic poets knew all too well, sometimes we have to go backwards to go forwards. So I'm going to digress briefly and go back to that conference paper I delivered on Shelley in Manchester, England in 2019. So the crux of my argument centered on Shelley's hymn to intellectual beauty, positing that the focus on this mysterious spirit is not actually some kind of romantic gesture that you typically equate to these types of poets. On the other hand, my argument centered on how this type of mentality is actually the foundation for Shelley's politics. Yes, people, I too have grown and matured from my days in the Bronx back in 2004. And this argument translates to Dylan as well. So let me lay it out there for you. With this pervasive focus on the immaterial aspects of life, the mysteries and uncertainties that we must confront and can never explain, well, I would argue that this stuff is the very reason artists such as Shelley and Dylan have such a political bent, one that is focused on the masses and on common human beings. Why would a poet from an aristocratic family who attended Oxford before being expelled, end up dedicating so much of his work to the unacknowledged and the underrepresented? How does a folk musician working and living in Greenwich Village become a voice of the people? A voice of racial and social injustice. Getting away from strict biography and thinking about the work they've produced itself. I think what I've written thus far may answer this question. Of course, some of you may have noticed a little religious undertone to this idea of the immaterial, which is not a bad read at all. For as I previously pointed out, that too was Shelley's initial instinct from his hymn. The mysteries of the world are exactly what many religions are attempting to explain. So yeah, these poets and musicians are actually acknowledging the same mysteries that religion focuses on. However, the difference is that as opposed to trying to explain the mystery or answer the questions, these artists let the mysteries remain. Getting serious vibes back to the Leftovers. Again, what you haven't seen, do yourself a favor and watch it. Unlike science and math, religion fails to offer an absolute answer, though much of it pretends to do so. Nevertheless, by putting ambiguity into the into the medium of art, these poets or Dylan make the matter a human matter, with divinity and afterlife being utterly irrelevant, as well as meaning. Alas, this notion brings human beings together through disparateness. We all face the uncertainties of the world together, no matter whom we are, where we're from, or what we may think and feel. The hymn to intellectual beauty, and I'm not there, accentuate this concept. Hence, the poets leave it up to us, the readers, in all of our disagreements. So art is not just about the artists, but it's actually about us, the public. If it hasn't been obvious thus far, this entire project has really been about readers and listeners the entire time. As opposed to religious doctrine or science or math, art does not exist to tell us what it's all about. But art is here to offer us, the readers and the listeners, vitality, and agency, as art creates active participants in the audience as opposed to passive receivers of certainty and orthodoxy. The problem with this concept is that human beings tend to be lazy, real fucking lazy. You've heard this rant before. Yeah, we'd rather just be told what it all means than actually have to think for ourselves. We'd rather just jump on board concerning some kind of belief system, whatever it may be, and then blindly follow like the sheep that we are, than actually put in the diligent work that is necessary to think for ourselves. We're lazy. Yeah, I've also said this before concerning reading. It's difficult. Again, I see all of those figures in the Dylan movie searching for answers because certainty is what the public wants. Certainty is easy, but reading is hard. It takes time, patience, and practice, in the end, resulting in anything but certainty. I know. What happened to all of those fun anecdotes? Oh, where's another story about growing weed or my douchey friends from high school? All right. Why'd you have to get so deep, Levin? Just bear with me, my friends. All right. Let's get through this last part, and I promise I'll come up with something obnoxious or sarcastic that will most likely insult one of you, or hopefully many of you. So in thinking about I'm Not There, through the medium of Shelley's hymn, it becomes clear that it is certainty that keeps us away from other ideas, other opinions, and more importantly, other people. Certainty constructs borders and leads to conflict. Recalling what I had to say about poetry concerning borders in the chapter on Pearl Jam and Radiohead, if we wish to avoid this facile orthodoxy, we must do so by challenging ourselves through different voices and different experiences, as I did with Radiohead and the Grateful Dead. We must accept that which is confusing, not just for the sake of confusion. A song such as I'm Not There brings us together as a people, not through a unified sense of meaning, but through a unified sense of difference, in which we can all have a voice, we can all disagree, we can all offer each other an understanding of the world that would never exist without this dialogue. Alas, is there anything more democratic than that? And it is all driven by confusion. Words can only do so much. Poetry can only do so much. But in the end, art becomes the catalyst for not just personal growth, but for cultural growth as well. You've heard this before. Creating a necessary tension amongst various voices, a tension that shall not ever be resolved, nor should it be. I'm Not There very well may be the most beautiful song I've ever heard because of its lack of clarity. Because it does not have words and thrives off of this sense of confusion. The title says enough. It says enough about language. It says enough about poetry. It says enough about us without saying a thing. Yes, it is this immaterial aspect of lyricism and poetry that keeps us coming back, that keeps us active. In his conclusion to studies in the history of the Renaissance, Walter Pater unpacks the relevancy of art for art's sake. In so many words, Pater urges us as readers to avoid complacency, while also suggesting that failure in life stems from what he calls forming habits. We grow comfortable with normalcy, and the unfortunate outcome of this comfort for Pater is lack of awareness or consciousness. We become numb. Alas, for Pater, the only recourse is through what he calls speculative culture. The discourses surrounding us that include questions, uncertainty, and more than anything else, newness. What could he be insinuating here? The answer is obvious, though Pater clarifies it with his example from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, once Rousseau comes to understand the temporality of life, locates the cure for this bleak acknowledgement in intellectual pursuits, or what Pater later posits, the world of art and song. Indeed, the one place where we can constantly be surprised is the world of art. We can constantly find something new, something we haven't heard or read before. Yet we must be willing to look for that which is different, constantly testing ourselves, as Pater argues. In a contemporary context, Pater is urging us to get away from, our overplayed, playlists and to listen to something new. Not just to watch the same old shit on television, not just to read, vampire and zombie novels all the time. Yeah, new artists, new songs, new genres, newness in general is what matters, for it is only difference that alleviates the unconsciousness of habit. Think about it. Remember the first time you heard that certain song, saw that movie, read that book, and were just blown away. You end up remembering almost every aspect of that experience, where you were, who you were with, all the details that come with moments of hyper consciousness. These memories create indelible moments that are seared into our brains forever. I mean, that is consciousness. I mean, I remember the first time I heard Pearl Jam. I was in my buddy Jeffrey's car. Jeffrey's one of the dudes that sold back his Nirvana CD. But yeah, I was in his car as we were going to rent a hotel room for our junior year prom. And he popped a CD into his portable CD player. Those of you old enough remember those old CD players that you'd plug into the tape players in your car. And I distinctly remember Jeffrey's words. It's time to have a little Pearl Jam jam. And that was when I heard Even Flow for the first time. I remember that moment from 1992 like it was yesterday. I can even see Jeffrey's large plastic soda cup that he got from La Bamba, the burrito joint on campus at Ohio State. Yeah, he'd keep that cup between the gear shift, and he'd use it for a butt tray for his Newports that he smoked. I mean, it's all still there. Now, I know and understand why Pater focuses on the world of art, mainly because it is a medium of constant change and constant interpretation and reinterpretation. How I'd argue that this translates to experience itself, as well as people themselves. Don't just listen to the same voices and same opinions. Travel to places that are different than what you're used to. But pay attention and get your face out of your phones. Try different foods, as strange as they may seem. I recommend, I don't know, a tongue and pastrami sandwich from a good New York Jewish deli. Being down here, a good Bayou style crawfish boil. Come on down and try one, peeps. A Chicago style hot dog. Yeah. A pig ear sandwich in Jackson, Mississippi. And as un-PC as this may be, yep, you got to get yourself some foie gras in a bougie French bistro. Sorry, PETA fellas. For this is the only chance that we have to get as many pulsations from this brief interval that we call life, as Pater suggests. Hence, the instability of language, especially poetic language, lends itself to creating consciousness because there's no true meaning to be found in words. They aren't there. Yet there's something else, something we can never quite name, and whatever it is, it lends itself, as Pater says, to keeping us burning like a gem-like flame. So we've come full circle, my friends. We now understand that there's something in music, in lyrics, in poetry, that can never be completely understood or conceptualized. Most importantly, you, the public, need to understand, this very high-minded notion is not just reserved for academics. Seriously, get away from the bad stereotypes concerning what goes on in the ivory tower. We're not up there just talking about high-minded shit. We're up there talking about hard shit, and in so doing, it helps us better understand the hard shit out there in the real world, the hard shit that affects us all. Now, all right. This point of mine has taken a serious hit in light of recent comments in the past year or so by certain university presidents concerning anti-Semitism. However, not all academics are of this ilk. Uh, they are the bad stereotype. They exist, don't get me wrong, but they're a bad fucking stereotype. Yes, there is a large contingency that do exist only in the ivory tower. And real world actualities are completely alien to their thought. I'll say no more about these seriously flawed individuals. But as I've gone on to argue in every chapter throughout this project, the analysis of language concerns real everyday matters. And this analysis can aid us all in understanding the real world around us and how we perceive the world around us. All right, maybe I just have one more word about those seriously flawed individuals in the ivory tower. Uh, they need to, listen to the previous sentence about the world around us. Nuance, all right? They can't just read everything through theory and think that that theory is going to explain everything. They must look at the world itself, all right? And when they're done, by the way, go back and listen to that sentence I just read again. If anything detracts from my argument, if anything detracts from anything I've been saying, it's those people. It is my connection to those type of thinkers who I utterly, utterly abhor. Think. Take your time. Don't just jump on the fucking protest bandwagon. Why don't you think about what you're protesting and who you're protesting for and what you're protesting against? Think. Oh, just take our time. Why can't we just take our time? All right, done. I'm off that. But yes, when I talk about the political consciousness that comes with this type of analysis, also ignore what Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson have to say about liberal professors existing only to inundate you with their liberal agenda. All I want to inundate you with is the ability to think for yourself. And there's no better environment for this agenda than in the world of art and language. I do not exist to make my students liberals, nor do I exist to make my students into the next F. Scott Fitzgerald or Maya Angelou. That's not what we're supposed to be doing in the classroom. As Alexander Pope urges in his essay on criticism, which is actually a poem from 1711, being a good critic, it's a great poem. It's all about criticism. And for him, being a good critic includes a heightened type of morality. And I tend to agree. Yes, being good readers often leads to being better people. And there's a big difference. Yes, there's a big, big difference between being a good reader and being well read. Consequently, my job is to help my students learn how to read complex, challenging language and to understand why reading this stuff is important in our day-to-day lives. Like I said, these are real-world, everyday matters. Hence, pondering the stuff that does not and will not ever have a concrete answer allows us to see the world as it is, incomplete, incongruous, and to begin to construct a conversation that includes the things, people, and places that are oft ignored. That's what the traditional college education was actually supposed to be about. It wasn't about learning a trade or getting a job. It wasn't supposed to be about the dollar bills. As I tell all of my students, it doesn't matter what your major is or what you're studying. Just become a solid thinker. Trust me, the job will follow. Alas, here we are. So pick up a book of poetry and read it, or a novel. Listen to music and lots of it. But pay attention to the words. Read the liner notes. Like previously mentioned, good streaming services will include lyrics. But do your research, all right, to make sure the lyrics are legit. Look at how language is used in all sorts of contexts, even outside of music, lyrics, or poetry, and talk about it. And when you're finished talking about it, talk about it again with someone else, someone who disagrees with you, but actually listen to them. Do not just discount that which is different. You never know. By focusing on language, you might actually learn something not just about the text itself, but you might also learn something about yourself. And in so doing, you might come to understand the world around you in a way you previously never imagined. That is art for art's sake. So I recently showed one of my classes a BBC documentary on Dr. Johnson. Right. At this point, I have no idea how many times I've referenced Dr. Samuel Johnson. It must be more so than anyone else, which is amazing. The 18th century thinker who created the first English language dictionary. And, there's this wonderful moment in the documentary when a scholar is explaining how Dr. Johnson went about finding the definitions for his words. And the answer, for the most part, was literature. Each word in Dr. Johnson's dictionary includes various examples displaying how the word had been used in the past. Examples from Shakespeare, Dryden, Donne, etc. For anyone who has ever used today's Oxford English Dictionary, you're probably recognizing how Dr. Johnson's dictionary is kind of a template for the OED. But one comment by the scholar really stood out. He remarked that how, in a sense, our culture comes to be defined vis-a-vis language. And in turn, culture itself is constructed from literature. Awesome. So what makes this notion so pertinent to our present discussion are the definitions of words themselves. Seriously, for those of you with access, go to oedget.com right now and start looking up words. I think I advised you to do this earlier in the chapter. And you'll discover what discussion. But anyway, you'll discover what Dr. Johnson established in the 1750s, which is that mainly words and their meanings are constantly changing. Words change over time. Words change due to place and where they are used. Words change rhetorically, depending on the user and the audience. In so many words, that's a bad pun, words themselves are malleable. So if cultures are constructed by words and their meanings, we must also acknowledge the reality that cultures are malleable and are meant to change, to progress, to overcome, to grow. Dictionaries grow as well. I mean, it's always a big deal every year when the OED decides to add new words to their dictionary. But we must be cognizant of the fact that we are continually attempting to define ourselves. Not through stable means, though. We must acknowledge that this attempt, it's not necessarily in vain, but predicated on the reality that there is no static meaning and that progress comes with the continual reassessment of how we go about defining and redefining ourselves. In essence, language and its equivocal foundation is the harbinger of cultural progress. So I think I'm done, my friends. I really don't think I have anything more to say. In the end, I hope we've come to understand that yes, music and musicianship is important, as are lyrics. Yet language signifies exactly what Percy Shelley posits. Not an underlying meaning, but an inevitable sense of ambiguity that is significant because this confusion pushes us, the readers, to think even more diligently and to never be complacent. The words or lack thereof are what's important, even in their unstable existence. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world for a reason. That's also from Shelley. Listen, I mean, if you couldn't tell, I've had a blast. I truly have, and I hope you've learned something. All right, I truly do. I hope that you disagree with a lot of what I have to say. It's certainly been an adventure, one that I hope was compelling. Maybe someday in the future, we can get together and we can all do this again. So I leave you with my buddy Friedrich Nietzsche. Without music, life would be a mistake. Rock and roll, everyone. I wish I was there to help her, but I'm not there. I'm gone.